is converted into a sore in the skin. He says those who had worshipped the beast and his image, they now receive a sore, some grievous, malignant sore in their flesh for having worshipped the beast. This comes upon them towards the end of the tribulation. And the only place, a plague or disease about which God gives us a lot of detail and information is leprosy. Turn back to the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 15, second book in the Bible, Exodus 15. Exodus chapter 15, and notice verse 26. Here God speaking through Moses, verse 26, and said, "If thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee." Leprosy is an Egyptian, North African plague. That's the first place we find it mentioned in the Scripture, as the Jews were led by Moses out of Egypt. And he says, if you will obey my law and obey my commands, I'll protect you from those diseases, that being one of them. Leprosy is the plague that fell upon the children of Israel, and they were promised if they kept the law that none of these diseases of Egypt would come upon them. Come forward just a little bit to the book of Leviticus, chapter 13. Now, the Bible is an interesting book. It's an amazing book because here you have 66 books, and I forget how many verses are in the Bible, 31,000 something verses in the whole Bible. And a doctrine of the Bible isn't just, well, let's find an idea, let's take an idea, and hopefully we can find some verse that sort of matches what we believe in, and we'll say that's it. No. Take any subject that the Bible mentions and go through all the verses throughout the Bible and compare all the scriptures that you can find that deal with that particular that same subject, that same word. And you take all the verses in total together, and they make up the doctrine. The total teaching of the Bible on any given subject is the doctrine of the Bible. And that's why when we talk about salvation, we talk about different dispensations of time. God told Moses and the Israelites, keep my commandments. He told Noah, build an ark. He told Adam, make sure you don't eat of that forbidden tree. If each one of these people did what God told them to do, they would be saved. So God told different men different things at different times. God didn't tell Noah, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. He didn't know anything about that. And he didn't tell you to build an ark. So putting everything in its place is also part of rightly understanding the Bible. But Leviticus chapter 13, and let's notice a few phrases in this chapter. Verse 2, "And a man shall have in the skin of his flesh a rising, a scab, or a bright spot, and it be in the skin of his flesh like the plague of leprosy. Then he shall be brought unto Aaron the priest, or unto one of his sons the priest." Verse 4, "If the bright spot be white in the skin of his flesh, and in sight be not deeper than the skin," and so forth. Verse 19, "And in the place of the boil there be a white rising, or a bright spot, white, somewhat reddish, and it be showed to the priest." Down to verse 24. "Or if there be any flesh in the skin, whereof there is a hot burning, and the quick flesh," quick, Old English meaning living flesh, "that burneth, have a white, bright spot, somewhat reddish, or white." And again down to verse 28. "And if the bright spot stay in his place, and spread not in the skin, but it be somewhat dark, it is a rising of the burning, and the priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is an inflammation of the burning," and so on. these references to a spot in the Bible are talking about leprosy. Leviticus 13 is talking about a disease or a plague characterized by a bright white spot in the skin. And there is one man in particular in the Old Testament who was healed of leprosy at the command of Elisha the prophet. In 2 Kings chapter 5, his name was Naaman. He was a Syrian. The Bible says he's a great captain. He brought great victory for his king. But it says, but he was a leper. That's a great sermon you can preach on the life of Naaman. He had a lot of things in his favor. He had a lot of honor in his country and honor among the other soldiers of Syria. But he had one thing wrong with him. He was a leper. And it's a great sermon that can be preached about how a man can have a lot of good things, but he's still a sinner. Leprosy, a type of sin in that respect. And he was told by Elisha to go dip himself 7 times in the Jordan River. And when he did, his flesh was made perfectly whole, just like the flesh of a young child once again. 7 times in the Jordan. Every time you see certain numbers in the Bible, don't just pass over them. They may have some connection with 7-year period of tribulation. They may have some application to 7 days of creation in Genesis chapter 1 and 1 day of rest. So Naaman's told to get baptized 7 times in the Jordan River, and that leprosy cleared up, and he was made immediately whole. Let's see, I'm going to bring this to a close here in a minute. Oh, okay, let's go back to the New Testament and come to the book of Jude, right before the book of Revelation. We're going to bring this to a conclusion. I know there's a lot of subject matter just in the few things that I've mentioned in the last little while. But in the New Testament, you have the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Then you have the epistles of the Apostle Paul, aimed at the church, starting with Acts, Romans, all the way through. Later on, the rest, I think about 13 books. Then you have 9 books, beginning with the book of Hebrews until the last book of the Bible, Revelation, what we call the general epistles. But more specifically, here you have, think about the books of the Bible this way. Here's the Old Testament. It covers the period of God's creation of the world, beginning the nation of Israel, His commandments to Abraham, the history of the Jews in Egypt, coming out of Egypt, in Babylon, coming out of Babylon, history of all the history of Israel. Then you have 4 Gospels, the story of the coming of Jesus Christ, living as a man, a sort of a transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So not everything in the life of Christ, believe it or not, can be made a hard and fast rule for you today. Following that are the epistles of the Apostle Paul, who is said to be the apostle to the Gentiles. He's the main preacher to the church. It wasn't Simon, he was the Apostle Paul. After that, what we call the general epistles are things that there may be some spiritual truths in them that you and I can learn from, just like we do when we read the Old Testament. But technically, they're aimed and directed at people left here after the rapture in the tribulation. And notice here, Jude one chapter, verse 23, verse 22. And of some have compassion, making a difference, and others save with fear, pulling them out of the fire, hating even the garment spotted by the flesh. The garment spotted by the flesh. Do you know the only disease, at least that the Bible indicates, that can afflict your flesh, your clothing, and even your house, get into the plaster of the house, is leprosy. And so that's found back in Leviticus 23. If you want to take the time to read that, it says if you find spots in the walls, spots in the clothing, spots in your flesh, all of these procedures to be examined, to be cleansed, to be... you know what they did in the Old Testament? Someone was found to be have all the signs of leprosy. They didn't say, well, you go out in the general community and just enjoy yourself. Just, No, they quarantine them. That's what we used to do with people in this country. You know why AIDS and BD and every other kind of transmittable disease just keeps spreading like wildfire? Because when we find somebody, they have their civil rights. They're protected, politically incorrect to tell other people about it. A doctor can go tell, if a doctor goes and tells his nurse, I just treated a patient with HIV, make a note in the file, that doctor can be sued for divulging private information from his patient, even to his own secretary, even to his own nurse. The patient has the control over it, and so you're living in a day and age of insanity. In the Old Testament, someone had leprosy, they isolated, quarantined him. They said when someone approached, the leper was to cover his mouth and declare himself unclean. He would say, I'm unclean, to warn the person who was approaching. You see all these people, because for all I know, that there may be some airborne component to leprosy as well. You can see all these people with masks on in China and Orient a couple of years ago with, what is it, SARS or bird flu or all these exotic diseases. No, not in America. America is one of the most insane countries, and yet it's still the best country. That's the thing. There is so much good here, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. But I'm telling you, it's one of the most insane. Everybody's got their civil rights and they're protected so that they don't have to have their feelings hurt. Oh, sure, you can jeopardize the health of an entire city, but as long as your feelings are intact, you feel good about it. We're living in a crazy world. Well, we didn't get very far. We got through a couple of verses and made a number of comments about them. But those men who receive the mark of the beast in the tribulation are going to receive a sore, noisome and grievous sore in their flesh as payment for it by God right before the tribulation is over. And I don't know if there's any way that they can escape God's ultimate wrath at that point. If there's a place that they go beyond any, a point of no return, maybe we'll consider that as we look at a few more verses next week. But I am glad that I'm saved right now. Getting saved right now is the easiest time to get saved right now. You don't have to pay any money for it. You don't have to join the church. You don't have to, follow the ordinances of the church or the sacraments of the church. You don't have to do anything except trust what Jesus Christ has already done for you. Because He suffered for my sins already. I don't have to suffer and do my best and hope I make it and hope I'm good enough. I'm trusting what He's already done when He died on the cross of Calvary in my place. Well, let's bow for prayer and conclude this evening.